Hello and welcome back. Saturnmania continues to spiral down the highway, Daytona, USA style, going 300 kilometers a mile. I'm obviously here gushing over Sega's redheaded stepchild of a system. The system that came and went in the United States, but prospered into a long-lasting and loving relationship with the fine folks of Japan. And then later us nerds are people who are in midlife crises. And some of us have spent way too much money on the Sega Saturn. And some of us have discovered things like the Saru to prevent that expenditure of financial resources. So this is my third installment of Saturnmania. The last two, I started off with a bang, Fighters Mega Mix. Then we showed off Radiant Silvergun. Go back and watch both of those. And I explain from the heart why I think those games are so unbelievably good. And I'll say this too, in both of those. So Radiant Silvergun has been ported a million times over, but there is something unique about the Saturn version. It just feels right. Playing it on a Saturn with the 6-button controller feels right. But you can play Radiant Silvergun today on Switch, Xbox, and I think PS4/5. For a long time, it was only on Xbox 360, and of course the Saturn version. Fighters Megamix is nowhere. Nowhere, Jack. The only way to play that game is on a Saturn, which sucks. So Sega, get your friggin' T's crossed and your I's dotted and make a Saturn compilation somehow, some way, and put Fighters Megamix on that thing, because that game deserves a bigger audience. It's really great. But it's a fighting game. And speaking of fighting games, we're going to talk about one of Sega's, it's Capcom's, but it came out on Sega Saturn. One of the more, I'll say, historically beloved ports of a Capcom fighting game, and in Xmen Vs Street Fighter for the Saturn. So real quick, I happen to own an arcade board of that game. This is a CPS2A board. So you have to have the B board, which I do have. It's just I have another game attached to it, and I'm not going to pull it apart because it, quite frankly, hurts my fingies to do that. But you have to have a B board and an A board. That's how the whole thing works. But the game is stored here on the A board. Look at the size of this thing. Look at the dumb, wonderfully stupid, dumb size of this game. And then realize that we're about to play it on a CD. So physics be damned, they mashed this big giant beast down into a CD. And with basically, it was kind of lossless. And that's like the big difference. This game did come out in America on the PlayStation, but that version stinks. There's so much cut animation. There's so much missing, quite frankly, from that port. And on this version, which was a Japanese exclusive that we're about to play, it's, I don't know if it's 100% accurate to arcade, but if it's not 100%, it's like 95 to 99. Like, because I own this, so I can Pepsi challenge this fucking thing. I can put this on my arcade cabinet, my Astro City. Go back and check out that episode. I show off that bad boy. And I can play the Saturn version. I could do a side-by-side, and I can't tell. I'm not saying that maybe you can't or can, but I can't tell. Like, so as far as I'm concerned, it's an arcade perfect port of a wonderful late 90s or mid to late 90s era Capcom fighting game that I think is one that is still very heavily beloved to this day. So let's get into it. I'm going to go ahead and do this. I'm going to do this, and I'm right there on the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. So we're at the Saru boot menu. I'm going to push A, and we're going to go backwards to the X's. Xmen Vs Street Fighter. So now what's really cool about this, I'll just go ahead and get us started here. And I think I explained this in one of the other Saturnmania videos. The Saru, not only am I loading the game from SD card, but it also has all of the features of the expansion RAM cartridge as well. So I get the benefit of all the extra frames of animation and all that good stuff that cartridge entailed. So real quick on that, as we watch the splash screen to this glorious fighting game, The Sega RAM cartridge came in 2 flavors. There was a 1 megabyte version and a 4 megabyte version, and they were separate cartridges. I don't have the real ones to show off, but I have the Saru obviously going, and I showed in a previous video the 4M action replay. The 1 megabyte ones, SNK game used a lot, so the Port of Metal Slug, some of the King of Fighters games, and then the 4 megabyte ones, Capcom used a lot. So not only in this game, but in the port of Street Fighter Alpha 3, known as Street Fighter 03 in Japan, and then Pocket Fighter, I think Marvel vs. Superheroes as well. I know Darkstalkers 3 Vampire Saviors also used it, and you had to use it. It was like running Majora's Mask on the N64. You had to have the expansion RAM pack in order to make that game work. So same thing. And they were sold as a bundle. So if you bought Xmen vs. Street Fighter, it was sold in like a box with the game disc and that cartridge. So it was, from a retail standpoint, it was impossible to get one without the other. And of course, in the resale markets, that changed, and you were often like this is in my case when I bought a Saturn from an EB for like $20. It came with Xmen vs. Street Fighter, but I didn't have the RAM cartridge, which is why I had to go buy the 4M cart from ncsx.com way back in the day. So let's do arcade mode. We'll get straight into it. So this game is the first of the Capcom Versus series. There's this one, then there's Marvel vs. Street Fighter, and then you start doing Marvel vs. Capcom. I'm going to pick my road dog, Juggernaut, because I could seriously stare at this dude's sprite all day. He looks so unbelievably cool. And then I'll pick Bison, because Bison is my dude. I'm not a big fan of Alpha Bison, that's who this is. You can only do Psycho Crusher as a super move, and they replaced that with this lame Fireball. But he still has his slide low fierce, he still has the scissor kick, there's still some Bison to love. No doubt about that. But let's take a look. I'm probably going to let him kick my ass while I talk a little bit about how great this game looks. But look at that animation. Look at Juggernaut taking up like more than half of the screen. That walk alone. If you saw this on the original PlayStation, it's like 3 frames of animation. It's terrible. It looks so bad. And actually, now that I think about it, and I could be wrong here, but I think maybe Juggernaut is not even in that version because it couldn't handle it. The thing about the Saturn is a wonderful piece of hardware that kind of came out at the wrong time for what it is. The Sega Saturn is a 2D gaming powerhouse. It's like how the Neo Geo was, but even more super. And at the time when engineers were working on it, the idea from Sega of Japan was that, well, the Genesis is doing fine. People still love 2D games, so let's make an evolution of 2D gaming hardware. That backfired. Obviously very historically backfired. Because, especially in the West, in America and Europe, 2D gaming was very much falling out of vogue. From the start, with games like Virtua Racing and Virtua Fighter in the arcades, people really started to take a shine to 3D gaming in America. And that was at the expense of 2D stuff. So when you get to like the mid-90s and the late 90s, in Japan, a lot of those games are still being made. Obviously, you know, if you were a fan of the Neo Geo, like I was and still am, that's all they did was 2D games, and they're being ported to various systems. The King of Fighters probably being the most successful of that. You had ports of King of Fighters coming out in America on the Dreamcast and on PlayStation. And then later on the Xbox and PS2, and I mean, it's still going. Like King of Fighters is still going, but those Neo Geo developed games, like SNK made them until 2003. So they started in '94, and the last one on Neo Geo hardware was 2003. So I mean, that's a lot. That's a lot of longevity there. But this game is kind of an outlier. This was very, very popular in the arcades. It was one of the few arcade games that people would go out of their way to arcades to go play at that time, especially where I grew up. Where I grew up, we had it was like a family fun center type place called Mulligan's. It was mini golf, all that good shit. And they had an Xmen vs. Street Fighter machine there, and I mean, it was one of the few arcade games that had like a line. People would be waiting to play this game. And a lot of that has to do with the popularity of X-Men from the 90s. That Fox Kids show was on the air for I think it was like 3 or 4 years, and it was beloved. It's still beloved. That's why that Xmen '97 came out and is a great show. And let's get the cheap victory with the time over. I have no problem with that. A W is a W. But yeah, this game sold really well in Japan, obviously. Even the crappy PlayStation version did really well. But then, especially the import Sega Saturn version was a big-ass deal. This was a thing that you could walk into an EB Games and they would have it in stock. Because it was people who had their Saturns, and in 1998, that was the last year of support in the US for the Saturn. And you had that famous last gasp of games that Sega released. So that was Panzer Dragoon Saga, House of the Dead, Die Hard Arcade, and Burning Rangers. And that was it. Like, Sega basically dumped those games out and said, see you later, we're working on the Dreamcast. But then you had this. So, you know, again, you weren't going to find this in a Toys R Us. You weren't going to find this certainly not at Walmart or Target, but at specialty video game stores across America and you know, mall stores like Funko Land and like EB. This was carried in stock as like a normal item with either an SD key or the 4M cartridge that I showed in a previous Saturnmania. Those were essential to getting your US version of a Saturn to be able to play these games. So, okay, maybe I should talk a little bit more about this game and what's special about it. It is a tag game. So right there, by pushing both Fierce Punch and Fierce Kick, I tagged in Bison. So King of Fighters came out like 3 years before this, and it was also a team battle game, but you couldn't tag. You couldn't tag out in King of Fighters until King of Fighters 2003. So for basically the entire run of that series on Neo Geo, you couldn't do what is arguably the selling point of this game, which is to freely tag in and out. You can tag in the middle of combos, which is so satisfying and so fun. And also you can do, let's see if I can do it here. I believe it's both mediums. You'll get like a quick attack from your partner. And nope, no dice there. Get my Stompy in there. But yeah, the tag feature is really what made these Capcom Versus games special. And that would continue in the series. So after this, you have Marvel Heroes versus Street Fighter. So same deal, the tag mechanism is in there. And then when they pivoted to Marvel vs. Capcom, which they've made 3 of those now, well, really 4, because Marvel 3 had like an expanded version that was, well, now that I think about it, I'm going to go ahead and have to say there's 5. So there's Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3, which added, I think, like a crazy amount of characters, like 8 to 10 new characters. So in fighting game terms, that's kind of a sequel, even though it's, you know, not marketed as a sequel. And then there's Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, which nobody likes. I, to be honest, haven't even played that game. I think I downloaded a demo when it was first coming, so I've only played that demo, and it didn't do a whole lot for me, which sucks because, you know, I really love these games. For me, the high point of the series, of the whole Capcom Versus series, is Marvel vs. Capcom 2. And I think that's probably going to be the fan favorite. If you were in on the Dreamcast back in the heyday of the Dreamcast, man, did people play that game. It was such a popular game. Still really popular. It is unfortunately a product of delisting now. Capcom did re-release it on PS3 and 360. It was available for purchase for a few years, but they lost their Marvel license, so you can no longer buy that game on either of those storefronts, which sucks. So the only way to play that game is to get it on Dreamcast. PS2 has a really good version. And then, of course, you can emulate the Sega Naomi, which is basically a Dreamcast. That's not a very difficult thing to do these days. But I think there was a re-release of this game too, called, if I'm not mistaken, Marvel. I think it was like Versus Origins or Marvel vs. Capcom Origins, but it had this game and Marvel vs. Street Fighter. That was the first time that these 2 games were released on newer systems. And same deal, the license is gone, so therefore you can't buy those games anymore on legal online digital storefronts, which is a shame because the PS3 store is still online, folks. You can put money in your Sony account and you can turn on your crusty old PS3. I almost said crinchy. Your crinchy old PS3, and you can download games on your PS3 today in 2024, which is kind of amazing. All right, let's pick some other characters just to show them off. I'll do Cyclops, and let's do a Street Fighter. Let's do good old Ryu, and I pronounce it Ryu because I'm 40. Here we go. Yeah, that was a whole retcon thing when Super Street Fighter came out on the home systems, and that terrible announcer says Ryu. It caused a lot of confusion for a lot of kids because we all knew Ryu as Ryu, and quite frankly still do, even though that is absolutely not the Japanese pronunciation of that name and never has been. But I digress. Ryu is Ryu here in the United States of A. So let me build up meter here. Look at this. Fills up the whole stinking screen. That super move. Oh, and he got me. All right, the other big hook about these games is the air combo system. Every character has a launching move. I'm trying to remember what Cyclops' is. But you know what? Before I get into air combos, let's appreciate this. Look at that running animation of Cyclops. That is the Sega Saturn difference, to be honest. And what's funny is the Sega Saturn, I think in the last decade or so, has really gotten a newfound respect and a newfound reputation. And it's 100% to do with how great these 2D games look today and how well they've aged. You could say a lot of Sega Saturn 3D stuff looks like absolute just stinky dog shit. And, I might enjoy them, find them endearing, but I'm not going to argue with anyone that doesn't, that can't get into it. Because it's admittedly really hard to get into. But these 2D games, man, and especially with all these indie games that have started to come out with these different art styles that all focus on, a retro look or a 2D look. This game could come out, if it never existed and it came out tomorrow, with the exception of the resolution, you would say, oh, this looks fantastic. What a great new fighting game from Capcom. And this game came out in 1996, so it's coming up on 30 years old. So it speaks to the artists, it speaks to the hardware, not only the Sega Saturn, but the Capcom CPS2 arcade hardware. It's just really, really good stuff. Let's finish with the super. Get that sweet sunburst effect. So cool. So cool. All right. I think I'll do one more fight, and then we'll return to gush over this game a little bit more and talk about, Capcom today. And, why they haven't done a versus game in such a long time.
Ready.
All right. Let's admire some of that. I don't care if Chun-Li beats me. I just want to look at Cyclops running. Because it is so fluid. So many frames of animation there. That was the deal, man. Capcom, they dabbled in 3D fighting games during the boom period of 3D fighting games. They had, Street Fighter EX, the series. On the Saturn, they have Final Fight Revenge, which a lot of people think is a terrible video game. And then you had Rival Schools. That was a 3D game that Capcom did. But their bread and butter in this era was still the 2D stuff. And you look at it, and man, it's real tough to beat. And I'm saying this as a Neo Geo guy, and you're never going to hear me say a cross word about Neo Geo. But Capcom was right there with them in terms of making really, really good and timeless looking fighting games that people still love to this day. Alrighty. Optic Blast, he says. Oh, another thing to note is a lot of the character voices in this game were voiced by the same voice actors from the Xmen cartoon, which I think is another reason why this game is so beloved back then and today. You have all that stuff. There's such a tie-in to that show that makes this a more memorable video game experience in general. Boom. Oh, there goes Cyclops. Here comes the Road Dog Ryu. Oh yeah, so they started doing this back in the first X-Men game, but if you push down and then up, you do like a super crazy jump. It's pretty neat. And that's how, if you do an air attack, which again, I can't remember any people's air attacks. So right there, Rogue did it. Launched me up in the air and then continued the combo in the air. That is one of the cornerstones of this game. Or the whole series, the whole Versus series did that. And it got ridiculous in Marvel vs. Capcom 2. I mean, you would be fighting in the air, for like 30 hits, 40 hits. Okay, let's do this. I'm gonna go whammo. I'm gonna go whammo. And one more little whammo on my end for me. Okay, so X-Men vs. Street Fighter for the Sega Saturn. Why is it so special? Why is it so important? I think it all boils down to import video game culture in the late 90s. That's when that stuff took off. And it took off at the same exact time, really, as the internet starting to take off. Obviously, people were online in the earlier part of the 90s. You had people on Prodigy and CompuServe and all that stuff. And that's all well and good. And I'm sure it was a terrifying and dangerous place to be. But as the internet matured and you started to see giant companies advertising their URLs, on regular ass TV commercials, that's kind of that era started here in the late 90s, and import culture became a lot more accessible. Like back in the day when I first started reading gaming magazines when I was like 8, 9, 10 years old, that was always something that, and I've talked about this on this show, that was always something that I dreamed of doing. But didn't have a lot of money growing up, and also my parents weren't super keen on sending checks in the mail, which is understandable because there was an episode of 2020 that showed check washing, which right there, boom, you got to shut it down. You got to shut that whole thing down. But anyway, I always wanted to import games in this time, and I couldn't do it. It wasn't until I got my first job making my own money. So I was 15. I worked at a movie theater. And so that was 1999. Yes, 1999 into 2000. And that's when I got a Saturn. That's when I made my first purchase via money order through NCSX to buy that 4M cartridge to be able to play X-Men vs. Street Fighter. And man, like that was a whole thing. Honestly, importing these games. So we talked about Radiant Silvergun and another edition of Saturnmania. Importing that game, X-Men vs. Street Fighter, Street Fighter Alpha 3, Marvel versus Street Fighter. Like those games, they were attainable. They were something that you could get either ordering them online through places like Game Cave or NCSX, or you could walk into mom and pop stores or even Electronics Boutique and they were available to buy. And that was like a really, really cool time. It was a time where this stuff was still like, it still felt exotic. Dare I even say it felt taboo. Like you weren't, because you weren't supposed to play this stuff. These systems were region locked. And for whatever those reasons were, Sega, Nintendo, they all did it. Sony, they all made it so that you can only buy games in your region for your region hardware. And it was stupid. It is still stupid. And today, with modern systems, we don't really have to deal with it. Behind me here on the shelf, like I've got a bunch of Japanese Switch games. I've got a bunch of Japanese or Asian market PlayStation games. And they just work. They just fucking work. And you put them in and you play, and there's very little hoops you have to jump through. Back on this stuff, you had to install mod chips. You had to buy little doohickey gizmos to be able to make these things work without region stuff. I do bitch about modern games. I think like a lot of people in my age group do, and a lot of that's for good reason. But one thing you won't hear me bitch about is the fact that today, right now, I can go on playasia.com and I can spend a bunch of money buying games that just wouldn't come out in the US market, games that appeal to me, and there's literally nothing that stops me. There's no hardware thing that stops me. My credit card works just fine on their website, and I've done it many, many times and will continue to do it many, many times because I grew up in that era where importing video games was special. It felt exotic. It felt unique, and so I still have a little bit of that, a little chunk of that still resides in me. And a big part of that for me is X-Men vs. Street Fighter on the Saturn. Let's show this bad boy off one more time, just because it's just so ridiculous. If I'll zoom in a little closer there. You can see the artwork. All these Capcom CPS2, they all had this blue blue ink on white for the Japanese boards. And I think I want to say so these things too were region locked, which is again so stupid. But the blue ones were, I believe, for US and Japan, or no, it's green is Japan. So there's blue, green, black, and orange, and you can Google it. But all the different color plastics have to do with their regions. So you needed to have a matched region A board to match the game board, or the B and the whatever. You know what I mean? The point is that region locking shit is fucking stupid, and it's over with. It's done. The most recent system that had region locking was the 3DS, and that was silly because the DS didn't have region locking. So I don't know what the hell Nintendo was doing there, but they corrected the course, and the Switch is all the way open. So buy a game in Europe, it works on your US Switch. Buy a game in Japan, works on your US Switch, vice versa. That's the way these things should be, and the way that they are now, and that's great. So I'm going to come back with some more Sega Saturn love on Saturnmania. I've done 3 of these. I think we're going to take it to maybe 5, and then I could say these are my 5 favorite Saturn games. So to recap, Fighters Megamix was the first one, Radiant Silvergun was number 2, Xmen Vs Street Fighter is number 3. What are going to be the last 2? I don't know, but you're going to need to tune in to find out. And I'll say like and subscribe, leave comments, offer suggestions, tell me I'm an idiot. Tell Uncle Bob he's an idiot for not liking old video games. I have no problem with that. Don't tell me I'm an idiot for not liking sports, because sports are a waste of time and they're boring. But I'll just leave that on the table next to all this shit, and say thank you so much for watching. Also, we're on Spotify. If that's your deal, go join us over there. Leave a 5-star review. All that good stuff. So, Saturnmania continues. Thank you so much for watching.